This is probably one of the most important advisory form that you should pay attention to in your transaction. And it is actually required by many lenders. So the lenders will ask your buyer and seller to sign this advisory form. Why is this such an important advisory form? The reason is that it covers many different areas of concern that the buyer should be aware of. Not only with respect to the seller's duties and obligations, it also involves the buyer's duties and obligations, as well as the agent's duties and obligations. Now, insofar as the seller goes, it educates the seller that the seller is supposed to disclose all material facts to the buyer. And then one important point to point out is that even if the seller is selling the property in its as-is condition, it is important for the seller to make disclosure on all material facts. And the form also clarifies agent's responsibilities. In fact, this is a form that might be used as a shield against possible claim of negligence for failure to make certain, to give certain advice to the buyer or seller. And it clarifies that certain defects and conditions may not be discoverable by a broker's visual inspection. And the fact that we give referral to another, we refer a professional to the buyer, does not guarantee, does not make us the guarantor of the inspector's performance, for example. So if they receive a bad report from an inspector that we recommended, they have no recourse against the real estate agents. So I guess the advisory emphasizes that it is still the buyer's responsibility to make the buyer's own independent, informed decision on who they should hire to do the investigation for them. Agents simply refer professionals to buyers for their convenience, but agents does not guarantee the performance of the inspectors that the agent referred to the buyer. Inspections. Paragraph 1 basically talks about the buyer's right to inspect the property and the seller's obligation to make the property accessible for inspection. I believe it is the seller's responsibility to make sure the electricity is available at the time of the inspection. Next thing we're going to talk about is the square footage. This particular paragraph basically advises the buyer that whatever square footage that an agent reports on the MLS, that is simply an approximation of the square footage of the property, such that if there is any kind of inaccuracy to what was reported, an agent is usually not responsible for the discrepancy. Likewise, if a seller reports a certain square footage of the property, and if it turns out to be inaccurate, usually a buyer has no recourse against the seller. I have been asked quite a few times to represent a buyer in cases where the buyer discovered that the actual square footage was actually less than what was reported. Most of the time I tell them they don't have a case, partly because of this advisory. So this is a very important form for an agent to remember to use. In fact, I'll make it a mandatory form for each and every agent. Now, when do you give this form to the buyer? really the best time to provide this form to the buyer will be when you submit the offer. So you check the SBSA box in your RPA, and then you include the SBSA. Okay. It has nothing to do with the inspection contingency. It's an advisory form that many lenders require. No, that's totally separate. This form, you give it to the buyer regardless of whether he has inspection contingency or not. It's a mandatory form for most lenders anyway. In fact, they won't even fund the loan until they see the SBSA signed by the buyer and the seller. Okay? So it is nice that you have the SBSA to protect you against any claim by the buyer in case you made a mistake on the square footage. Now, of course, if the mistake is large, it might be a different situation. But if it's only a couple hundred feet here and there, for example, if you have a 2,000 square feet building and 200 square feet is like 10% off, okay? And 10% off seems like a lot. However, you know, because of paragraph 2, you may be shielded from any liability. Soil and geologic conditions. Now, let's talk about the lot size, boundaries, and surveys. This particular paragraph actually advised the buyer, if they want to find out the true square footage, the accurate square footage, that they should look to the appraiser for the accurate information and not rely on the agent's reported square footage. Okay? Same thing with the lot size and boundaries and surveys. Now, the lot size, boundaries, and surveys, the best person to get accurate information from is actually the surveyor. Okay. So this is all covered. So you're not required to independently inform the buyer that it should get a surveyor. Okay. It's all covered in here. So if you forgot, or if you did not tell the buyer to get a surveyor to do surveying on the property, and it turns out that the lot size was inaccurately reported, at least they won't be able to sue you for negligence because you've already, through the SBSA, advised that they should get a surveyor. So the SBSA is actually a very good friend of the agent. They do all the advisories that an agent would ever need to advise their client. There are going to be certain things that we would accidentally omit, but the SBSA will cover it. Okay? Same thing, the soil and geologic conditions. Now, usually when a property is on a hillside, the buyer should always be advised to hire a geologist to provide a report on the geological condition of the property. And if you forgot to advise the buyer to do that, this takes care of it. Okay? And then there are certain types of geological hazards that a buyer should be aware of. And a buyer is also informed about certain booklet that the seller will provide to the buyer. It's called the Commercial Property Owner's Guide to Earthquake Safety and things like that. That's all covered in the SBSA. Okay? So as you can see, the SBSA is a very comprehensive advisory. It covers all sorts of situations imaginable. And it also covers the environmental hazards, lab-based paint renovation, repair, and painting rule. Okay? Now, sometimes you might be asked by the buyer to explain this form. You're not required by law to explain this form to the buyer. You're only required by law to provide this form to the buyer. If you have provided this form to the buyer, you would have fulfilled your responsibility as an agent. there is no law that requires that you translate this document to your buyer. Formaldehyde, mold. These are just some of the environmental hazards. This is a good mold advisory. Basically, it says here the building inspector does not cover mold inspection. So if a building inspector, if a home inspector, for example, provides a home inspection report, he might mention that it is recommended that the buyer get a mold expert to further look into the potential mold contamination. That's all covered in paragraph number 8. Water intrusion. This one basically mentions to the buyer that it is not uncommon for properties to have water intrusion, and real estate agents and possibly home inspectors are not experts to investigate water intrusion. And it talks about getting other types of experts, such as a roofer or some other expert to investigate into the water intrusion problem. Same thing with the septic tank. A home inspector is not the right person to get a report on septic tank. If you want to get your septic tank inspected, first of all, this one advises the buyer that there are certain properties that don't have sewer system. They are not hooked up to sewer system, and certain properties actually will have septic tank. Okay. Now, if it's one such property, then the buyer is well advised to hire a septic tank inspector to come and inspect, and then give a report and certification for the septic tank. The purpose of the septic tank certification is to let the buyer know what is the capacity of the septic tank and how full is the septic tank. Whether or not the septic tank system needs to be repaired and things like that. Okay. A typical septic tank report and certification will probably cost about $800. Well and water systems. There are some properties that don't have potable water and they rely on the well for supply of water. And these wells would have to be tested for bacteria and microorganisms. And again, it emphasizes that the home inspector and the real estate agent are not experts in this area, and the buyer are well advised to find an expert who will test the quality of the water. Wood destroying pests. It talks about Section 1 and Section 2. Section 1 refers to situation where there is evidence of infestation of termites, whereas Section 2 refers to situation where there is no evidence of infestation of termite. However, there exist conditions that are likely to lead to infestation of termite. It used to be that we will always make the seller be responsible for Section 1 repairs and then the buyer Section 2. But that practice has been abandoned. So in these days, if you represent a buyer, please let your buyer know. Seller no longer, under the terms of the contract, required to make Section 1 repairs. If there's any repairs, it's all on the buyer. Paragraph 13 talks about easements, access, and encroachments. Basically educating the buyer that there may be certain roadways or private driveways that might affect their property, and this is the easements and access issues that the buyer needs to be aware of. And if the buyer wants to know the extent of the easement, they should always hire a licensed surveyor. In fact, we look at the last paragraph. It says buyer is advised and brokers recommend the buyer hire a licensed surveyor during the buyer's inspection contingency period. So whatever that you fail to do in terms of orally advising your client, it's all taken care of through the SBSA. In paragraph 14 on the SBSA, it talks about earthquake fault zones and seismic hazard zones. And again, it says that this type of information is available through a geological expert, such as a geologist, a registered California geologist. Fire hazards, he mentions about fire hazards, what the buyer needs to know about fire hazards on paragraph 15. And again, it says, broker recommends that during buyer's inspection contingency period, buyer contact the local fire department and buyer's insurance agent regarding the risk of fire. Again, it emphasizes that it is not an agent's responsibility to go get this information for the buyer. It is the buyer's own responsibility. Flood hazards. Mentions about flood hazards. And if we look at the last paragraph, it says if buyer wants further information, brokers recommend that buyer consult his or her lender and or insurance agent during buyer's inspection contingency period. Brokers do not have expertise in this area. And again, the broker is not required to give the buyer any advice in this area under the law anyway. And this paragraph 17 talks about the fact that the zone maps may change. Okay, some areas are not deemed to be earthquake prone area or fire hazard prone area. May subsequently be rezoned to be in this area. So a buyer needs to be aware that just because your property is not in an earthquake zone or fire zone today doesn't mean that it will not be in the future in that zone. Building permit, zoning, and code compliance. This one is rather important, so I'll read the entire paragraph for you. Buyer and seller are advised that any structure on the property, including the original structure and any addition, modification, remodel, or improvement may have been built without permits, not according to the building codes or in violation of zoning laws. Further, even if any structure was built according to the then existing code or zoning requirement, it may not be in compliance with current building standards or local zoning. It is also possible that local law may not permit structures that now exist to be rebuilt in the event of damage or destruction. Buyer is advised to check with appropriate government agencies or third-party professionals to verify permits and legal requirements and the effect of such requirements on current and future use of the property, its development and size. If buyer needs more information, brokers recommend that buyer discuss the issue with an appropriate professional during buyer's inspection contingency period. Brokers do not have expertise in this area. So this one explains that a broker is not required to answer any questions regarding permit situation on the property. It says that brokers do not have expertise in this area. Okay, so if you fail to advise the buyer to go to the city hall to check for permits, and the buyer later found out that the certain construction was not permitted, you would not have any responsibility. Okay, so this sort of protects the agents as well. But on the other hand, if you choose to do it on behalf of the buyer, it might create liability if the buyer rely on your work. So the bottom line is, if you don't do it, you don't have any liability. if you decide to help the buyer to go check it out, and if it turns out you gave the wrong information, there might be a problem. Okay? But in terms of a service point of view, there may be some, I guess, a waiver of liability. If you want to do it, we may have to create some form for that purpose. Okay? But right now, as it stands right now, if you don't do it, if it turns out that some construction was not permitted and you totally was not aware of it, then you have no liability. But if you're aware of it and you don't disclose, then there is liability. Okay? All right. So, I mean, as far as zoning, code compliance, building permits, you guys are not expert in this area anyway. Nobody really expects you to advise the client. It's all in here. They are advised to go to the city to check it out. Okay? Now, views. Number 19 talks about views. This one basically explains to the buyer that today they might have view, tomorrow they may not have views. Okay? So views are not guaranteed. That's what this paragraph says. Okay. Paragraph 20 talks about future repairs, replacement, and remodels. Okay. Now it says buyer and seller advise that replacement or repairs of certain systems or rebuilding or remodeling of all or portion of the property may trigger requirements that homeowners comply with laws and regulations that either come into effect after close of escrow or are not required to be complied with until the replacement, repair, rebuild, or remodel has occurred. Now, this is precisely, you know, you have a very old building. A garage was built under the old building code. Normally, they will not do anything. They will not cite you for anything unless you're seeking repairs or seeking remodeling. So the buyers are advised that if you buy such a building, you know, if you do seek remodeling, some of this construction that was made prior to the building code being changed may now have to be brought up to code. So that's the risk that you may have if you seek remodeling. Okay, so this 20 talks about future repairs, replacements, and remodels, such as a old garage that was damaged by a electrical post that fell down on the garage and destroyed the garage, and now a new permit needs to be obtained to rebuild the garage, and that garage may not be rebuilt because of the existence of some new codes that prevents the garage from being rebuilt. So the buyer needs to be aware of that, and this is in paragraph 20. Okay. Golf course disclosure. Now this is for properties that are close to golf courses. The danger of golf balls hitting your glass, right? The danger of noises from the golf course, and then the landscaping on the golf course that may affect you, things like that. Loss of privacy because you're close to the golf course. That's all covered in paragraph 21. Okay. Now 22 talks about school district. Now it's actually now if an agent, this actually protects an agent. Of course, if you advertise a property for sale, be careful about the school district. Now you might think that a certain property is located in a school district when in fact is located in a different school district. So when you get a property ready for the MLS, check it out. Be sure of the school district. If you're going to report certain school district on the MLS, paragraph 22 sort of give you some protection in case you kind of messed up. Okay. Now this one says buyer and seller advise that children living in the property may not, for numerous reasons, be permitted to attend the school nearest the property. Various factors, including but not limited to open enrollment policies, busing, overcrowding, and class size reductions, may affect which public school serves the property. So what that means is, say for example, you advertise on the MLS that this house belongs to a certain school district, and then the buyer buys the house, close the escrow, and after they close escrow, they learn that their kid cannot attend the school district. 22 might protect you, okay?
So if I check at the time, then later they change, like the school change, the property changes.
Yeah, you protect them. You protect them. If there are any changes,
I checked at that moment, but later they change.
then you'll be protected. Regardless, most of the time you'll be protected anyway. It's really hard to sue an agent for a mistake made on school district because of the SBSA. Okay. All right. It says here, though, eventually if you look at paragraph 22, it says buyer is advised to verify whether the property is now and at close of escrow will be in good school district. You see, the buyer's responsibility to check it out. Okay. And 23 talks about neighborhood noise sources, right? So buyer and seller advise that even if the property are not in an identified airport noise influence area, the property may still be subject to noise and air disturbances. And again, sometimes, buyers are unhappy that they didn't learn about certain sources of noise until after the escrow closed and want to sue the agent. Paragraph 23 actually protects the agent to some extent. It says here, buyers advised to satisfy himself or herself with regard to any sources of and amounts of noise at different times of day and night. Brokers do not have expertise in this area. So this sort of gives some protection to the agent. Pets and animals, and this talks about feces and urine odors, that may have accumulated from time to time. It's really hard to sue an agent for something like that. It says, if buyer wants further information, broker recommends that buyer discuss the issue with an appropriate professional during buyer's inspection contingency period. Brokers do not have expertise in this area. Okay. Yeah, it's really hard to sue an agent for something like that. The seller maybe, but not the agent. Swimming pool security and safety. This one actually advises the buyer about the legal requirement to have certain barriers next to the pool, okay, and other safety mechanisms that a buyer can have. So it actually saves you a lot of work. You don't have to do any of this. This is all done through the SBSA. 26 talks about retrofit building requirements and point-of-sale requirements. Point-of-sale requirement talks about certain city requirement where the city actually makes it mandatory for you to have a city inspector to go to the property to inspect the property before they let you sell the property. It's called the point of sale. Okay, so one of the things you will check out when you list a property is whether that particular city has a point of sale requirement. If it has, such as I know City of El Monte or City of Monterey Park used to have point of sale requirements. There are some cities that has that requirement. Okay, and it says here, broker recommends that buyer and seller consult with appropriate government agency, inspectors, and other professionals to determine the retrofit standards of the property, the extent to which the property complies with such standards and costs. And again, a broker would have no responsibility to go and do this type of thing for the buyer. It's actually the buyer and the seller's responsibility. Water shortages and conservation, and this one is basically asking the buyer and seller to check out any possible water shortages or problem in that city, or water conservation problem involving that property, okay? Or any city requirement or government requirement regarding conservation. Some cities or government actually require that certain types of what do you call that, low flow water, this flush system be installed, okay? And that's being mentioned in the SBSA. Neighborhood area, personal factors, high-speed rails, and smoking restrictions. Now this one talks about the neighborhood, talks about personal factors, talks about crime area, internet access, airport, military, all sorts of environmental problems. Okay, but that's taken care of through the advisory SBSA. You don't really need to engage in any conversation with the buyer on this. Okay, it's a lot of work to try to explain this to the buyer. High-speed rails and smoking restrictions that are all mentioned here. You know, some people like to live close to high-speed rail, other people don't want to live close to high-speed rail. And then the certain properties that say here, many cities have enacted restrictions on smoking in parks, public sidewalks, beaches, and shopping areas. Some jurisdictions have restrictions entirely banning smoking inside privately owned apartments and condominiums. These are things to be checked out by the buyer, not by the broker. If buyer wants further information, brokers recommend the buyer contact local agencies about these restrictions. Underground pipelines and utilities. Now this one talks about the fact that certain properties may have underground pipelines and utilities. So it just want to make the buyer aware of this possibility. Marijuana and methamphetamine labs. This is a good disclosure on marijuana. If you think that you might be involved in certain areas where property might have been used to grow marijuana, okay? It says the buyer is strongly advised to retain an environmental hygienist, contractor, or other appropriate professionals to inspect the property if methamphetamine production is suspected to have taken place. Brokers do not have expertise in this area. So if you sell a property that later turned out to be a meth lab before, or a property that was used to grow marijuana, and you were totally unaware of it before close of escrow, and the buyer tried to sue you, it will be difficult for the buyer to do that. Insurance and title insurance after foreclosure. This one basically educates the buyer that if they buy property that from a foreclosure, sometimes it's hard to get title insurance. Okay, so just kind of educate the buyer the difficulty of getting title insurance if they buy this type of property. So this sort of protects the agent as well. Owner's title policy. I will not get into that. I don't have that a lot of time today. So in fact, I'm coming to the end. I will cover the rest of the paragraph next week.